We will begin with the prayers. Now, can you all hear me? Please raise your hand if you can hear me. I'd like to wish all the Sangha members from the monasteries and nunneries. We also have some Dharma centers who are participating. And we have quite a few Dharma centers, of course. We weren't able to prepare for all of the Dharma centers to join us, but we're just trying it out this year to have a few Dharma centers joining us. And we also have many Dharma friends listening over the internet. And there are also people who are watching on the internet in China. In particular, all of our relations who are Tibetans. And I'd like to wish my greetings to all of you. So today, the other past days, we've been speaking about the Vedic period, and in the Vedic period, we've been speaking about we spoke about the early Vedic period, and we've completed that discussion. So today we have come to the later Vedic period. And so in terms of the time, the later Vedic period was from the 11th century BC to the 6th century BC. That is about the time period we're speaking about. So basically between the 11th and the 10th centuries BC, all of the non-Aryan peoples who had previously lived in Punjab, that is, its original inhabitants, had been conquered. They were subdued and came under the power of the Aryan peoples. And among them, some people surrounded and would listen to what they're told, and they became like the slaves of the Aryan peoples. Those who wouldn't listen or who did not surrender were sent to exile far to the south. Even among the Aryans, they moved to the south of the Five River Basin of Punjab and then arrived at the valley of the Ganges River. So I think if you can see this, you will understand it. So if you look here, we see the Aryan people came from this region through the Khyber Pass. And they were settled in the area of this Indus River and among all of the of its tributaries, and so they settled in the area of the Five River Basin of Punjab, and then they gradually came to the Ganges area. So they moved to the Ganges River Basin. When they got to the Ganges River area, they lived in this region. So the time of the later Vedic period so during this late Vedic period, they moved from the Punjab to the Ganges Valley. So basically, the place where they formerly had been living was in the northern direction, and they moved to the central India on the banks of the Ganges. When you've got to the area of the Ganges River is much larger than the Ganges River is much larger than the Sindus River that they had previously known. The Ganges is the largest river in India. And likewise, the plains around the Ganges River are also the most fertile area for agriculture, the most suitable for agriculture. And so when they came to the Ganges and saw such a large river and saw the very good fields around the Ganges River, they began to develop kind of more courage and so they also had a great improvement in their livelihood, much better there. And also their culture really developed greatly. Now, during this time, and during the early Vedic period, when the Vedas first appeared, the kings, we could say, as I said before, at that time, they lived as in tribes. The Aryan peoples were not a kingdom like we would have today. Instead, they lived as different tribes or different clans. And so each tribe, so among all these different tribes, the people would choose whoever was most suitable to be their chief. And so they were called this someone who's respected by the majority. So they take, as it was said, they would take the person they most thought was most important and became a king, would become the king. And so there was no tradition of there being a hereditary monarchy where the kingship was passed down to their son. It's like the way it was done in ancient Rome. The kings of there was no real particular king in ancient Rome. Instead, they had a leader whom they chose, and as it is explained in the history. So it's similar with the Aryans. And so there was no tradition of a hereditary monarchy at first. But after the Aryans had settled it around the Ganges River, then gradually there became the tradition of a hereditary monarchy where the kingship was passed on to the king's son. And at that time, there began to be the particular soldiers in an army. And at that time, a soldier at that time. So in the early Vedic period, the soldiers also had to do household work, the agriculture, and the sacrificial rituals. So the householders had to perform many different functions. But later, then the soldiers began to be a hereditary tradition where they became like an inherited position, or so became like this became one of the royal or the kshatriya governing caste. And so this way the king and the army were both hereditary positions. And so this is how the kshatriya caste developed. Then there were the ordinary people. There was the populace. And what they did, they also began to, whether they were farmers or whether they had another craft, they began to pass their occupations on from father to son as well. And so this became the Vaishya caste. Now, in addition, as I mentioned to it, there was the Brahmin caste that was a bit above these. And so in this way, we have the three castes: the Brahmin caste, the Kshatriya or royal caste, and the Vaishya caste. So all three of these castes were all only made up of Aryan peoples. And so these three castes were all allowed to recite the hymns and to perform sacrifices. And so it was also said that not only was one born as an Aryan person, but also because of the Vedic religion. After after entering the religion, they would also begin a religious life. They'd be allowed to do the practice of Vedic religions. They're also able to lead a religious life, and so for this reason, what they were called is dvija, or double births. So they're called dvija, so double births, because they're out of not only a human life, they're also allowed to have a religious life, and so they're called a two birth. This is a name that appeared later. Now, the other members of the population, other than these three people, were called the Shudra. And so, who are these Shudras? These are the people who had surrendered to the Aryans, as I mentioned before. They're the people who had originally inhabited that area, and when the Aryans invaded, they had lost to the Aryans, and after they surrendered to the Aryans, they became like the servants or slaves of the Aryans. And so when they became starting, what the Aryans called them was Baryans or slaves. That's what they called them. In any case, the people who had surrendered to the Aryans were all they all did not have the same rights as the people in the previous three castes. And so what they were called is they were called the single birth, or once born. They're called Ekaiti or Ekajati. Basically, they're called born once, because that in that one lifetime, they could only be servants, and they'd have no right to practice the Vedic religion. And so, for this reason, they could only lead a servant's life and could not practice a religion. And so, for that reason, they were called once born. However, at that time, when the Vedas, the origin of the Vedas having this caste system of four castes, this happened during the latest Vedic period, but it was gradual. As I mentioned the other day, the hierarchy of castes depends upon the different crafts or trades that you do, and so it developed that the caste development out of that, and so it was coming primarily out of the trades, not out of the race. And so, because the kings, because it's a hereditary caste, and so they were in the royal caste or the kshatriya caste, and the army was also hereditary, so it's also passed down into. So it's also in the kshatriya or royal caste, and then each of the different trades were passed down from father to son. So they were also the Vaishya were also a hereditary caste, and so the people who had surrendered were in a different situation. But basically, the division into four castes developed over time. It wasn't like there was all of a sudden a division to four castes. It's like as the four castes got larger and larger, then they had that. Then out of that, they developed the distinctions into the four castes. So, as we said before, the Brahmins, and then there are also the governing castes that were called the Kshatriyas. Now, in Tibetan, what we call the royal caste, but it's only one word. But actually, it's probably the Rajanya was probably the royal caste, and Kshatriya was a different caste. So actually, So in Sanskrit, there are two names, but only one name. So basically, the Kshatriya was the Tibetan word Kshatriya includes both. It also includes the king and the ministers and the armies. And so it includes the Kshatriya includes all, and Rajanya, there's two words. So if we think about the Tibetan words, it would only include the kings, but actually, in actuality, it includes the caste includes the kings, the ministers, and in particular the military officers and so forth. And those who did the agricultural and the crafts and the trade work, most of the populace were called the Vaishya. The Vaishya caste. No, there are the populace who are the Shudras were the ones who performed who acted as servants and so forth. Now, these four castes, these later became very stable, and it became like an inalterable tradition, right? And so that is how it arrived, how it developed. So basically, how it developed with the Aryan peoples is divided into three peoples, right? Then after dividing them into three, their most responsibility in their lives was to do these sacrifices. So that was the most important responsibility. And then who performed the rituals? Those were only the Brahmins who performed the rituals. And so for that reason, all of the traditions of the religion and the culture at that time were primarily done for the profit or for the sake of the Brahmin caste. That was taken as like the basis. And so at the later, so for that reason, we sometimes call this the Brahmanical civilization of the later Vedic period. And so this Brahmanical civilization lasted for about 500 years or so. Now, during these 500 or 600 years, when Brahmanical civilization developed, there was, when you talk about the spiritual, the knowledge about the mind, there was a great spread and development in spirituality. Unless there are just an incredible number of innumerable philosophical schools and literary traditions that developed. So when we speak about the later Vedic period, in order to make it easy to understand and easy to keep in mind, I'm going to take this 500 or 600 year period of the later Vedic period and talk about it in terms of three parts. I think that'll work out better. And so the way we'll divide it is this. The first section is the four Vedas. The second section is the Brahmanical period. And the third is the age of philosophy. And so, as I already mentioned before, the Indian literature, and in particular the Vedic literature, as it developed, and wasn't like concluded with the composition of a single text. There are really many different literary works that appeared one after the other. And even with these literary works, the time when they appeared, some of them appeared at the same time. And some would appear in sequence, and so they're so different. And so my division here into three different parts is not primarily in terms of time, saying that after the four Veda appears, then the Brahmanical period. Instead of that, the time that the four Vedas and the Brahmanical texts appeared, if you think about it in terms of the time, they could have been they could have been simultaneous or even alternating, and so there are different ways that it could have happened. So when I'm dividing into three parts here, I'm primarily speaking about the way the literary or the textual works were written. You can talk about it in English, you would talk about it in terms of the literary form or the literary genre. And so that is how we're dividing into three. And it's not a question it's not a chronological decision. Because if we do it in terms of the chronology, you'd say, oh, first are the four Vedas, then the Brahmanical period, then the age of philosophy. That's not it. We're talking about in terms of the literary form or genre, that it's divided into three parts. And so first, I'll speak about the four Vedas. And so how the four Vedas were compiled. I've already spoken about the Rig Veda, but so how is it that all four of the Vedas were compiled? So this is what I'll speak about next. So now, as I mentioned before, when you talk about the Vedas, if we take a broader view of the Vedas, all of the Vedic literature could be called the Vedas. So when we talk about Vedic literature, if we divide that into different parts, then we can talk about it there being three parts. Now, the first of these three parts is called the mantras. It's also called samhita. In any case, in Tibetan, this is called. In Tibetan would be either no or dupa, so the mantra or samhita. These are the root texts of the Vedas. Now, the second part arose from the Brahmanas, so it's called the Brahmanas. So these here the Brahmanas. It's not talking about the Brahmin caste. It's talking not the Brahmin caste. We're talking about the Brahmanas texts. These Brahmana texts is just understood. The name of this text means like the Brahman. And so, as Kenyan Chiba said, that basically all of so the beginning, Chiba spoke about how this is a text that includes all the Brahmanic literature. And the third section here is the Upanishads. And if we translate this, it would mean Genyan Chiba would translate it as being like respect. But actually, I think it's more about sitting nearby. Let's say sitting nearby means that generally this is a philosophical text. And so in the old days, when the philosophical texts were taught to the students, they had to be taught in secret. And since they were taught in secret, the students had to be very near the teacher. And the teacher would secretly teach it to them. And so that's why it's called the sitting nearby, is probably this, I think. If we think about the types of we have the first, the root text of the Vedas, and among them there are the four Vedas. Then the second type is the Brahmanas. The third is the Upanishads. When we talk about the Samhita or the mantra, if you think about the Samhita, the root texts, there are also four types. There's the Rig Veda, Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Attvara Veda. So I spoke about these the other day. So these are the four parts of the original Samhita or Vedic texts. So these are the four Vedas. But when the Vedas first appeared, there was only the Rig Veda. There was none of the others. The other three were not there. And the Rig Veda was not written down. When it first appeared, it was transmitted orally. It was spoken from one to the next. And the time when it was compiled was actually in the later Vedic period. And so it was during this particular period that we're speaking about now, the later Vedic period. Now, the other three Vedas were also compiled during the later Vedic period. So this time of the later Vedic period, when we speak about it, as I mentioned, there are three different parts of it. And so the first is talking about the four Vedas. So we can speak about the first section is to speak about, when speaking about the Vedic period, the Vedas, we're speaking about how the Vedas were compiled. The second part, speaking about the Brahmanical period, is speaking about the texts of the Brahmanas. And then the third period is what we call the there's the text of the Aranyaka. And so during this period, there's also the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, which is another text that appeared, the Brahmanic text that appears this time, and also there was the Upanishad. So these three texts, the Brahmanas, the Aranyaka, and the Upanishad, appeared during the Brahmanical period, as did the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And so first, I'd like to speak about the root text of the Vedas. As I mentioned the other day, the text of the Vedas and the Brahmanical texts actually took several centuries to complete. And during those several centuries, there are many people who edited them. And in the end, they were compiled and to produce the text that we can see in the present day. And so the Vedas that we can read now, before those appeared, the texts were written over time during that time. So that time when they were composed and written, it's possible that one happened after another in a sequence. It could be that while one was being written, that another was written at the same time. And so the time is not fixed. However, with them, what is somewhat certain is that it's the Rig Veda was first, and the other three Vedas appeared later. And so this is clear. And so then the Brahmanas and the other texts probably appeared at either after the latter three Vedas or at the same time as them. Now with the four Vedas, we've talked about them as the root texts of the Vedas, and they're primarily hymns in praise of the gods. So among them, the Rig Veda is the earliest of the Vedas. And then after that is the Sama Veda. And then there's the Ajra Veda with its two parts, the light and the day. And then there's Atharva Veda, which among all of the Vedas is the most recent, the latest of the Vedas. So among these four, the Rig Veda is the earliest, and it's the foundation of Vedic literature, the basis of Vedic literature. And then the Sama Veda, what this is, most of its contents are actually texts that were primarily in the Rig Veda from the very beginning. But what's a little bit different about it is that with the Sama Veda, there are many different manuscripts of it, and among these different manuscripts, it was compiled from different manuscripts. And so the Samaveda, to talk about it in brief, it's like taking addition of all the different texts that comprise the Rig Veda into a single text. And the Samaveda is like a new collection or a new edition of the Rig Veda. It really doesn't have much contact or any, it doesn't have that much that is not also already in the Rig Veda or in the Rig Veda. And then the last one is the Yajurveda, and the Yajurveda is divided into two, the light and the dark. And so the reason why the dark texts are called dark texts, because they're the root texts of Vedas, and then also commentaries on the Brahmanas, on their philosophy that are kind of joined together. And because they're written kind of together, and it's not very clear that what the distinction between the root and the commentary is. And so they're called dark, and because the distinction is not clear. So you don't know how to distinguish the root from the commentary. You don't know it, and so it's called the dark. And so this is why they are called the dark Yajurveda. Now in the Yajurveda, there's another little different aspect of it that is a bit different, is that in the Yajurvedas, there are the texts from the Rig Vedas, and then it's combined with Brahmanical texts. And because the root and the texts that are combined together, it's a sort of rather different text. And so that is what we call the Yajurveda. Now with the light Yajurvedas, it's the same in that the root text and the commentaries are combined. But the distinction between the root and the commentary is very clear, so they're called the light or the clear Vedas. So when we're talking about the Brahmanical texts, I'll speak about that later, so I don't need to speak about it now. So in brief, what many researchers think is that the Samaveda and the Yajurveda take the Rig Veda as their base and just add a little bit to that. That way they're a little bit different, but fundamentally they're basically both taking the Rig Veda as their basis for this reason. So they're wondering, why is it if you already have the Rig Veda, do you need to add more in the Samaveda and the Yajurveda? When they're thinking about this, they think, and still really do not clearly know the reasons why they're needed. However, many scholars generally accept, is that, as I explained yesterday, in the Rig Veda, when you're doing sacrifices, that you need 4 priests, or ritvij. There are 4 ritvij, or priests, that you need when you perform a sacrifice. So these 4 different types of priests. Because there are 4 different sacrificial priests, the first one, the first priest does a lot of ritual, and he's the one who oversees the ritual. And so for that reason, what was written for him is they wrote the Yajurveda. Now the Samaveda is a separate text, and the reason it's different is because it is for the second of the priests. This is the one who recites the proses, who sings the melodies along with drums and music. So he needs the text to recite to the gods, right? And so for that reason, they compiled the Samaveda. So in brief, the first and the second of these two fathers are for the first and second types of priests. you have this is how the Yajurveda and the Samaveda came about. These scholars hypothesize. And so at the time of the Vedic tradition, it gradually developed, and their religion spread greatly. And as it gradually, after it had reached a certain point, what happened is that at first it was basically having faith in the gods, but they didn't take much interest in the spiritual and the internal mind. They didn't appear. So when the Rig Veda first appeared, they had a lot of faith. Excuse me. At the beginning, it was very. They took a lot of interest in spirituality and feeling faith and devotion in one's own mind. But later, what happened is that the ritual aspect became very strong. So later, they primarily emphasized the external actions of body, speech, and mind, or the body and mind, body and speech. And so, during this reason, the Vedic tradition became one that primarily focused on sacrifices and rituals only. And when you're doing all these sacrifices, the priests said, and so during a ritual, all of the movements that the priests would make, like by moving their hands, would have to have a particular meaning and content. And all of the everything they had to recite became very complicated. And so what happened is that all developed. The rituals became extremely complicated, and that people just couldn't handle. They just were unable to figure out what was going on. And so it's so complicated that people just didn't understand what was happening. Unless they had already studied what was being done, there was just no way you could easily do it. For example, if you're supposed to do if we're going to do like a Mahapujas, we need to do the Vajrakila, and people say, oh, it's so complicated, you can't do it. It's not like that. And so the reason why is because it's such a complicated ritual that ordinary people aren't able to do it. So it's kind of the same. And so when that happens, then because it becomes really so difficult, then you need to write it down. So you need to write it down. And you need to explain the practices in detail. And so for that reason, the Vedic texts of the Yajurveda and the Samaveda, and that is why these texts appeared and the other Vedas appeared. Not only that, there are also the commentaries on the rituals in the Vedas, and so that became the Brahmana texts. And so there are so many different texts and rituals, and the main reason is because that such a great increase in the ritual practices, and they're so complicated that they all had to be written down in order to be able to explain people how to perform them. And so that is how these texts developed. Now, within the Yajurveda, there are just a whole lot of different rituals. There are some rituals you do one time in your lifetime. Sometimes they do once a year, some that you do monthly. So there are some rituals that you do every day. There are all sorts of rituals, sacrificial rituals. So I thought I'd like to give an introduction to you of some of the most important of the Vedic rituals. Now, most of these Vedic rituals are from the Brahmanical period or from the later Vedic period. And among them, the practice of the tradition of these, or the transmission of these, is still present in this day. So here I would like to show you the names of these 8 important rituals. So first, there are those that appear there. There are those that during the waxing and the waning phases of the moon. And the second is the rituals to give food to the ancestors. This is similar to our Tibetan burnt offerings or suet offerings. Then there are also fire pujas to Agni. And these are probably fire pujas that were to be performed daily. Then there is the 4-month sacrifice. And so this is one that they continue to do today for 4 months, from the 7th until the 10th month. It's like they only eat one time a day. They have one meal a day. And some also practice silence during that time. So this is the time of that period. And then there is the Agni Shtom, the offering of emetitus. So basically, to say it is, it's giving alcohol to Agni. Then there is a ritual of coronation of the king. This is an important ritual, so I'll speak about it below. Then there is the horse sacrifice, which is very well known in history, so I'll give an introduction to that below. And the last one is the Agni Adana, the offerings to Agni. So I'll explain that before. So first, I'll speak about the coronation ritual. This is a very important ritual. So generally, as I mentioned before, all of those rituals I mentioned before are extremely important rituals. However, within there are many different rituals in the Yajurveda, but because of the time, I'm not able to mention them all. So I thought if I'd explain the ritual for coronating a king or for enthroning a king. Now, this ritual this coronation ritual, now this text this coronation ritual comes from the Brahmanas text that I appeared. Now, it's not a single text. It's actually quite a few texts. The Brahmanas include many different texts. And within that, there's a text of it. It's called the Aitarya Aranyaka. And so this is a Brahmanic text in the Brahmanas. And what it says there, so the way the coronation is conducted is described in that text. So what it says is that in that time is that the first thing you have to do, and so basically we're talking about when a king is being enthroned, right? So when you're enthroning a king, the first thing you need to do is you need to have the king's throne. And you need to cover the throne with a full tiger skin. And so I would say the one with all 4 of the limbs. So basically everything, including the claws. And so you need to prepare that. And we cover the desert, and you don't put it so it's upside down. When you cover the fur has to be up and visible. And then there's the head there, and the head of the tiger need to be at the east or the front of the throne. And so you have to spread out the tiger skin in this way. And the reason why you need to spread out the tiger skin is that the tiger is the king of all animals. And so if the king uses the tiger skin and sits on it, then then they believe that this would mean that his reign would be stable and powerful. Then when the king was being enthroned or coronated, The king would be brought in from the back, and he would come to the back of the throne, and while facing to the east, he'd have to stay at, he would kneel on one knee, and he'd sit behind with his two hands and hold the throne with the two hands and recite a mantra. So he'd hold the hand of the thrones and recite the mantra. And at the same time that he's reciting the mantra, then the Brahmins, there are the Brahmins at that time, have what they called a special water or holy water. It's kind of like our vase water. It's like a special water, a particular water, not just any old regular water, but they'd use a special, superior water, holy water. They take that higher water and they would pour it over the king's head. They'd pour the water over the king's heads, and once they had warmed it over, while they're what the mantras would say, they would say, "This is the king of the world." They would say. Following then at the end of the very last thing is the king would be given the amrita, that is alcohol to drink, and then sit on, they'd probably make him sit on the throne and drink. And so that's what the coronations that would conclude the ceremony of coronating a king. And so the reason why this is so important is that we always talk about giving empowerments. And so this is like the source for the empowerments. When we have the traditions of the empowerment, the origin of the rituals come from this. So giving empowerment is an Indian. And so actually the tradition is basically you are empowering somebody to be the king and you're giving them empowerment. Now, these days, when we talk about empowerment, we actually don't give you anything. We say these different names. You say you're achieving the wisdom and gaining wisdom and so forth. But in the old past, in the old days, when you're empowered, you're empowered as a king, and you'd be given the power of a king. And to give someone the king's royal power, it's not, you wouldn't just say, it wasn't just it wasn't just a question of sitting on the throne and saying, "I'm the king." It has to be something that's in accord with the religious traditions. And so they did the ritual in order to make sure that the king was, the power is stable and that he is recognized and done in an appropriate fashion. Now, the second type of ritual is the very famous ritual. This is called the horse sacrifice. So we can call it the horse sacrifice, or in the Kanji Ninjas, it's also called the horse sacrifice in the Kanji. Gendo Tripla called it the sacrifice of the fine horse. Now, the reason why the horse sacrifice originally had to be performed was primarily so that people could have children. So you'd sacrifice a horse in order to have children. But later in the Brahmanical period, the purpose of the horse sacrifice was not so simple. It wasn't just a question of having more children. Its purpose and its aim become completely different. Now, the horse sacrifice was, so who did a horse sacrifice? It was not a sacrifice that just anyone was allowed to do. Even if you're a king, you didn't necessarily have the right to do a horse sacrifice. In fact, who could do it was not just a king, any old king, but a king of kings. A great king was, such a great king was allowed to do a horse sacrifice, but not anyone else. And so at that time, what people believed at that time, I said, if you were able to do it with 100 horses, if you could sacrifice 100 horses, then it'd be incredible benefits. And what the benefit would be is that if you had did a sacrifice of 100 horses, you'd be able to stay the state of Indra, become the king of all the gods. And it also had the benefit that you'd be able to give dominion and power over the entire world. Now, so the way the ritual was conducted is that is that you had to choose a horse. And this horse had to have a particular horse. And I've seen many pictures. I think you had to get a probably, and I've only seen all the pictures, it's always a white horse. It had to be a horse with a particular color. So you choose the horse, then you bathe it so it's nice and clean. And after you've bathed the entire body, you'd just let the horse go and let it wander wherever it wished. It's kind of like the beings who, when you do a life release, letting an animal walk wherever it goes. Now the horse is allowed to wander wherever it wanted for a year. Now, wherever the horse, they would send people to go watch. Where is it the horse went? And so if you have 100 horses, you have to 100 people. You have to send 100 people to see where do the horses go. And you have to send people to follow them. Not only that, the king himself, the king who was performing the Hisman, had to go take the army and follow the horses, come a little bit after the horses. And as he was going, the reason why the king would come before is if the king would go into the land of another kingdom, then the king would have to follow. And the king of that kingdom, where the horse had wandered, would either have to surrender or would have to go to war. There was really no other choice. So the king performed the responsibility of the king for performing the horse sacrifices, that he had to gain power over all the kingdoms for the horse had wandered. Then he'd have to bring all the kings back to his own palace, back to his own kingdom. And if during that time, if the king were to perform the horse sacrifice were to lose, all the regular people would say, "Oh, he'd be like a real object of scorn and ridicule." If he were victorious in battle, then after he returned to his country, he'd become extremely well known. And so once he returned to his country, then he'd have that horse. You have to kill all those horses that you had let go. And after killing all the horses, then you have to have a sacrifice of the animal meat. And so historically, this is a very well-known sacrifice. So for this reason, the king was able to perform a horse sacrifice. Being able to perform it showed that the king was very strong and powerful. So we speak about universal emperors who wield a wheel. So this is similar to when you have the king performing a horse sacrifice, conquering kingdoms, and then returning to their kingdoms. So there's several who depend. So these were called the universary emperors for that reason. And so I think that the universal or Chakravartin emperors were related to this horse sacrifice, because at that point the king would become really a powerful king. Wherever they wanted to go wage war, there's no one would be able to oppose them. And so for that reason, they are called the kings, the universal emperors, the wheel-wielding emperors. And so now we will take a half-hour break.